You are listening to Savage Bites, Season 3. Original weird fiction. Written, illustrated, narrated and produced by Christian Bravery. Episode 28. Giant's Bane. Ragnathor Giant's Bane wiped the tainted ichor of the fallen hunger beast from his sword blade, a contemptuous expression on his chiseled features. It had been a long fight. He was battered and bloody, his body racked by a dozen grim, glistening wounds. Even so, an icy fire yet burned in those deep-set steel-grey eyes, and in his heart he remained undaunted. Many of his brothers had fallen during their embattled sojourn through the grim, devil-haunted forests of Mothdrangule, and the notion that he may join them in the halls of Valhalla ere this day was done did not overly trouble him, if that be the toll he must pay to secure the head of his ultimate foe. Ragnathor glided silently between the ancient trunks as the fringes of the dark woods began to thin out. He moved with all the subtle vitality and coiled strength of a stalking tiger. His breath even and steady, his eyes level and alert, the heavy bastard sword, Doom Scalpel, held at the ready and wavering in his steely grasp. Behind him, lost and scattered in the forest, lay the vacant corpses of his brethren. He knew that now they watched over him from beyond the veil, quaffing great horns of bitter ale, laughing and elbowing each other in anticipation of the bloodletting to come. Doubtless ere long they would be taking bets on the outcome. Ragnathor would not disappoint them. The Nala and its foul kinfolk had harried the northern tribes for a generation and more, ever since awakening from their long slumber, an awakening precipitated by the withdrawal of the great glaciation. Legend had foretold of their coming, for the ancient texts held a dark account of previous incursions long ago. Their coming had been bloody and terrible. Many of Ragnathor's kinsmen had been murdered, and women and children had been taken as plunder for sacrifice and for meat. His own father had fallen in defense of the village, and his elder brother had been lost in the pursuit of the ravening band who had perpetrated the crime. Ragnathor had been but a stripling then. Now, years later, things were different. Now he was a man. More than that, he was a man of the northern tribes, as hard and sharp as steel, his strength and skills honed in the fires of battle, his ice-cold demeanor quenched in the blood of foes encountered. Ragnathor would avenge his kinfolk and rid their lands of this foul menace once and for all, or he would perish in the attempt. Looming beyond the shadowy fringes of the wood, surmounting the lofty precipice beyond, was the fabled stronghold of his enemy. Its name had been lost to time. Once, long ago, it had been a magnificent castle, whose cyclopean ramparts were said to have been raised by a strange and ancient race who had ruled these lands eons before the coming of the first men. Now it lay partially in ruins, its vine-draped walls crumbling, its once mighty towers abbreviated by time, yet still thrusting skyward like the mortis-rigid fingers on the hand of a dead titan. The footings of the ancient fortress were cloaked with a thin, shifting mist. Somewhere inside lurked the Nala. Ragnathor licked his lips, for the moment at a loss as to what to do. Dare he enter the accursed edifice in search of his foe? Venture into the very lair of the thing, where it would enjoy every advantage? His natural inclination was to close with his enemy sword in hand. Yet he knew in his heart that to face this foe so boldly would lead only to death. Though it stung his manly sensibilities, Ragnathor knew that guile would be required if victory was to be his. If needs be, he would enter the stronghold of the beast, but perhaps there was another way. Perhaps he could lure it out into the open, onto neutral ground. Sword in hand, Ragnathor broke from cover, crossing the narrow, shrub-studded sward that divided the forest from the castle ruins at a dog trot. He came to a halt under the shadow of the castle's great gates. Wrought in bronze and ornamented with elaborate bosses, they towered to a height of perhaps 50 feet, an age-old crust of verdigris, masking the luster with which they had shined eons before. Ragnathor hefted his great sword and struck the door with its iron pommel, buckling one of those elaborate bosses with the force of the blow. 1, 2, 3 times he struck it, and the ancient gates rang with a deep sombre note, like the tolling of a great cracked bell. Around him, the forest fell silent, all the little incidental unnoticed sounds of the forest creatures dropping away, to be replaced by a stillness pregnant with anticipation. Then, from somewhere within the ghost-haunted depths of the ancient fortress, there came a distant, bellowing retort. It was at once deep and strident, reminiscent of both the trumpeting of the bull mammoth and the warning growl of the cave bear, each magnified to gigantic proportions, and it struck a sudden note of terror in the heart of the man who had summoned it. Ragnathor lit out across the sward at a pace, his feet flying as he fled for the tree line. Attaining it, he dove into the undergrowth and rolled, his head popping up to peer intently through the quivering fronds at the distant space he had lately quit. Now he waited, as motionless and as patient as a bronze statue. He did not have to wait long, however. Soon the great gates shrieked mightily, with the rending sound of metal on metal, as one vast panel swung ponderously open, the strident note instigating a great uprush of forest birds, who wheeled and flocked in manic confusion before flapping noisily away to the east. The opening of those great gates revealed a deeper darkness within, and out of that darkness, enveloped in a miasmic mist that sloughed away like a gossamer garment, whirling and eddying, ventured the Nala. The hated thing was huge, a monstrous and deformed parody of the human type, its cyclopean silhouette looming darkly against the distant ruin of the castle and the storm-laden sky overhead. The great bulk of the thing was bloated and misshapen, its thick hide studded with rock-hard scales. The limbs were twisted and ill-made, though heavily muscled, its hands reminiscent of the crocodilian, each of its thick stubby fingers terminating in a wickedly hooked claw. This was an impossible enemy. How could one man, with naught but naked steel in hand, hope to defeat such a monster? Brave as he was, in that moment Ragnathor felt the subtle nagging of doubts at the fringes of his resolve, but he thrust them away in contempt at his own cowardice. There was always a way. If it could kill him, he could kill it. Such was the way of things. Nothing, not even this monstrosity, was invincible. The Nala had at first been ignorant of his presence, concealed as he was by the cover of the trees, but now, as he watched, he saw it sniffing at the air inquisitively, much as a dog might do, and he felt the short hairs at the back of his neck rise in realization that the beast had now caught his scent. The very ground beneath Ragnathor's feet shook at its footfalls as the thing advanced. Its boulder head cracked in a savage snarl, revealing 2 irregular rows of blunt incisors like millstones. Above the gaping maw, arrayed hexagonally, were 6 oil-black eyes, the pitiless eyes of a spider. They probed the tree line, from whence the sweet scent of man-flesh had come. The clawed hands of the beast were clenching and relaxing in expectation of a fresh meal of meat, and he could feel the rumbling staccato bass note reverberating in the soft coils of his innards as it growled. Sheathing his trusty sword, Ragnathor unlimbered the great hunting bow he carried across his broad back. From the cover of the tree line he notched his first arrow. The bow was mighty, constructed of laminated steel and elkhorn and the wood of the yew. Any ordinary man could not have bent it more than an inch. Yet Ragnathor was no ordinary man. He was a wolf of the far north, of the sullen northern tribes that ply the oceans in low, sleek ships, and hunt the mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros for sport and for meat. It was said that giant's blood ran in the veins of his tribe, and he was the tallest and the strongest among them. Ragnathor drew back the great bow, and the thick muscles of his back and shoulders rippled beneath his sun-bronzed skin. The elephantine hide of the Nala was, according to legend, reputed to be impervious to blade or bow, and from what Ragnathor could tell, he saw no reason to doubt the wisdom of the claim. To stand the chance of killing the ancient beast, a warrior must strike at its one vulnerable spot. The eyes, those were its one weakness. Only by striking their eyes, by blinding the terrible creature, could victory be secured. The heavy shaft leapt betwixt the bow and its target in the blink of an eye, striking its mark with an unerring accuracy. The iron tip puncturing the glistening surface of one of those gleaming black orbs, the shaft plunging deep, socketing itself in the great boulder-like head of the beast. "One," quoth Ragnathor under his breath, his steely eyes glancing heavenward. Somewhere beyond the veil, his brothers roared with delight and clashed their cups. With measured concentration, he notched and loosed a second shaft, and it too struck home with the effortless accuracy of the master archer, blinding yet another of the monster's coal-black peepers. At that, the foul beast gave vent to a deafening bellow so terrific it shook the very boughs that arched above Ragnathor's head. It charged the tree line then, in a wild rage to lay hands on its elusive assailant. Rattled by the beast's onrushing advance, Ragnathor's third shaft missed its mark, its iron point lodging home harmlessly in the scaly armor plating of the monster's great head. He broke from cover as the vast shadow of the Nala fell across him. Moving like a scalded panther, he deftly evaded its headlong assault, exiting the tree line and skirting the fringes of the wood as the monstrous beast raged among the trees behind him. Losing himself once more among the forest boughs, Ragnathor quickly shinned up a tree growing at the edge of the wood. He climbed with all the agility and self-assurance of a jungle cat, attaining the tree's upper reaches in short order, all the while listening, his keen ears alert to the activity of his antagonist. Not far off, the great brute maintained its onslaught, uprooting the trees where he had lately hid, like a petulant head gardener evicting so many offensive weeds from a daintily manicured palace garden. Surveying the scene from his new lofty vantage point, Ragnathor found that the monster had now taken pause in its wanton destruction. The full flush of its anger had, for the moment, subsided with the realization that its stinging antagonist had fled. Now it was listening intently for any hint of the one it sought, and ever and again it would taste the air with its tongue, much as the dancing snakes did in the hectic bazaars of Shem far to the south. Ragnathor was out of arrows, the bulk of his quiver spent in the slaying of those enemies who had sought to bar the passage of his ill-fated band through the darkling wood. The mighty hunting bow had played its part well, but now, without arrows, it was useless. In the battle ahead, Ragnathor knew he must close with his colossal foe in hand-to-hand combat, and trust to his wits and to his courage, and to the fabled blade he had once seized in bloody triumph from the dead hands of a king. Ragnathor nervously readjusted the grip on his sword hilt. Doom's scalpel was a formidable blade, and it had in its time sent many a foul creature screaming into the deepest craters of hell. Now it seemed puny and pathetic in comparison with this mighty foe, and wholly insubstantial for the task at hand. But it was far too late for any doubts. A dangerous game was afoot, a deadly game of cat and mouse. To the winner, the spoils, and to the loser, naught but dissolution and death. One misstep now would seal his fate at the crushing hands and grinding jaws of a pitiless monster born from the pit of Hades. Yet he held his nerve, for he knew in his heart that, should he meet his challenge bravely and with honour, he would have naught to fear. For beyond the veil of a valiant death lay Valhalla, and a reunion with his fallen brothers, and with all his ancestors of old. Ragnathor's steely eyes were locked on the monster as he crept cat-like out along a sturdy branch projecting over the sward far below. He had a plan. Pursing his lips just so, he let out a strident whistle that cut the weary silence that had settled over the forest at the cessation of the monster's initial rampage, echoing eerily from the crumbling walls of the distant ancient fortress. The hideous beast froze at the sound, its head tilting as it sniffed the air, hunting for the telltale scent of its quarry. He whistled again, and the monster whirled to face him, its 4 remaining eyes scarring the edge of the wood as it crept forward. Ragnathor gripped the sword hilt in one white-knuckled fist, and slowly drew his thin-bladed poniard with the other, gripping it point downward. He squatted atop his branch, poised and ready, a bronze statue hidden among the leafy fronds, scarcely even drawing breath for fear of discovery, as his monstrous foe bore down steadily on his position. He had chosen his spot well, but as the beast moved ponderously below, it suddenly caught his scent, and the hideous thing craned its bull neck to lock eyes with him. In that nexus point of decision, Ragnathor cast mortal fear to the 4 winds, and dropped on his hated foe from his vantage point above. He drove the heavy spear point of his bastard sword with all the strength of his mighty arm right into the space between the great beast's 6 spider-like eyes. The sword blade dug deep and stuck fast, providing an anchor point for his death-dealing assault. And on the instant he commenced a frenzied attack on the beast's only weak spot, driving the needle-tipped poniard again and again into the beast's vulnerable eyes. 2 had already been destroyed by his arrows, whose broken shafts yet remained buried in their milk-white remains. 2 more were quickly dispatched under the flurry of dagger blows rained down by the furious barbarian. His bloodlust was up now, and he felt the wanton joy of battle flooding through his veins. He could almost hear the loud guffawing and the bellows of encouragement of his dead brothers in Valhalla, and he sang an ancient war ballad well regarded by his people as he plunged his dagger again and again into his deadly foe. The tormented beast roared and flailed its vast bulk, leaping and writhing as it thundered athwart the narrow sward, like a startled bull in pain and rage as it fought to dislodge its attacker. All the while the Northman hung on for grim death. Another eye burst in a welter of yellow ichor as the savage blade tore into it. At that instant the thrashing beast found him, its flashing claws grasping him bodily and tearing him clear, dashing his flailing carcass to the ground at the edge of the high precipice. For several moments Ragnathor lay supine, stunned and helpless, at the monster's mercy. Yet it was too preoccupied by its own fury and its wounds to seize the advantage, and this allowed him a brief respite in which to recover his wits. and to clamber groggily to his feet. As he did so, the monster itself regained some degree of composure. Realizing it had freed itself from its stinging tormentor, it hunted for him now with its one remaining eye. Bruised and battered, and only half conscious, Ragnathor tore the heavy hand axe from its place on his belt and hefted it in one leathery palm. This was his last throw of the dice. It was do or die, to win through despite the odds, or to make such an end as would be worthy of a song, though none were present to witness the deed. Ragnathor swept back his throwing arm as the beast charged, letting fly the axe as it drew near, the knotted cords of his rippling thews cracking with the effort of the throw. As the axe left his hand, wheeling through the air, time seemed to dilate oddly, to slow down, and Ragnathor was suddenly struck by the oddest sense of detachment or disassociation from this most visceral of all possible moments. He felt the oddest and most intense sensation of déjà vu, felt that he had been here, in this very situation, in this exact moment, 1,000,000 times before, and would be 1,000,000 times again. His world suddenly fragmented into 1,000,000,000 shards, and in each his entire existence was reflected in infinitesimal detail. In that inundating instant of realization, he knew that he had always fought Denala, knew that, win or lose, he would go on fighting the damn thing, in a bewildering and everlasting repetitive loop that stretched across an unfathomable realm of multidimensionality. His head reeled, overwhelmed under this devastating flood of transcendental insight. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, and in its wake it left a hollow echo of inescapable, claustrophobic horror. He was back in what he had hitherto always known as reality, with all the focused physical and corporeal urgency of the now. His axe resumed its lazy arc through the air toward his hated blood rival. The weapon's flight was inearing true, and its razor-edged head lodged itself deep in the final socket, splitting the monster's one remaining eye in twain. The foul beast gave vent to one last bellow of hideous agony, in a crescendo of anguish and despair, an almost unendurable gust of miasmic decay washing over him as it exhaled its dying breath. Ragnathor, in his exultant triumph, spotted the looming danger too late. The beast was done, his mighty foe vanquished against all the odds by this lone barbarian from the frozen north. Yet it still flew at him, the momentum of its rampaging attack, an avalanche, carrying its monstrous carcass onward, even in death. His cat-like agility would not be enough to save him this time, as the mammoth weight of the foul thing fell upon him, crushing his diminutive form beneath a titanic mass of corpse flesh. Devin hurled his game controller at the floor with what little strength he could muster, inspired by a sudden overflowing of petulant rage. In his headset, he could hear the disembodied laughter of his friends. The upwelling sting of their jeering tirade felt like an actual physical violation, goading him to new heights of impotent fury. He tore off his headset, temporarily silencing them. "Fuck!" he snarled in peak exasperation. "Fuck! Fuck this stupid game! It's not fair! It's impossible! They made it too difficult!" He glared at the screen without seeing it. In his mind's eye, he retraced Ragnathor's final moments, like the stunned recollection of a fever dream. "Shit game anyway," he muttered sulkily. "I'm gonna return it," he concluded, not for the first time. "Devin!" The call drifted down to the basement from above. Upstairs in the kitchen, his mother called again, after a pause. This time, her voice held a strained note of irritation. "Devin! Your dinner's on the table." Devin sighed. This again. Why did she insist on dragging him upstairs when she knew he was busy? Stupid bitch. With effort, he hefted himself out of his armchair and, setting one knee uncomfortably down on the threadbare rug, stretched for the controller. It would be broken, of course, and, as if to affirm his assertion, one of the shoulder buttons fell away as he gathered it up with a grunt, the tiny piece of plastic skittering away between piles of greasy pizza boxes and teetering towers of empty soda cans to disappear among the dust and the dog hair underneath the TV stand. He examined the controller, his lips thinning in vexation at the sight of its cracked carcass, and at the telltale rattle that came from within. His fury rekindled at the injustice of it all. "Mom!" Devin yelled, venting his ire. "Just bring it down, I'm busy." In the silence that followed, the continued jeering of tiny voices reached his ear from the discarded headset on the floor. His eyelids lowered in contempt. At least he'd gotten further than they had. It had, in fact, all been their fault, he told himself. If they'd done better, if they hadn't got themselves killed like a pathetic bunch of noobs so early in the game, if they'd been there to support him in the final battle, things would have been different. "Here you are, love." Devin's mother appeared, descending the stairs. She carefully set his dinner tray down on the cluttered coffee table beside his chair. "Pepperoni pizza with anchovy, crispy donuts and a bottle of Coke. Your favourite." Devin grunted. "Get me a new controller," he demanded, his eyes locked on the screen. "This one's broken." "Another one?" she implored. "Devin, how on earth do you expect me to afford—" "I need it, Mom," he interrupted. "Do you want me to take the tablets again?" His eyes met hers for the first time in a lingering stare, dripping with silent recriminations. She held his gaze as long as she dared, but his mother blinked first, as she always had since the incident, her eyes dropping sadly to the floor. She made her exit without another word, leaving her son to his own devices. Alone once more, Devin thrust one hand into the depths of the armchair, his fingers groping among the crumbs and the detritus in search of buried treasure. The old controller he recovered was cracked too, but this one worked so long as you mashed the buttons extra hard. It would suffice until that nagging bitch provided a replacement. Satisfied for the moment, Devin retrieved his headset from the floor, cupping it over his ears. Stretching for the pizza with a grunt of exertion, he selected a slice. Slapping its pointed nose on his outstretched, quivering tongue, he ripped off a huge bite. It was 10 p.m. The night was just starting. He spoke with his mouthful into his headset mic. "All right, me jiggles, who's up for another round?" You have been listening to Savage Bites, Season 3, Episode 28, Giant's Bane. I hope you enjoyed this story. I certainly enjoyed writing it. I was keen to evoke the Robert E. Howard Conan kind of feel, and really wanted to go over the top with the references to the rippling thews and the bronze skin and the cat-like agility and strength of the character. I had a lot of fun with that sort of stuff. I'm not sure this really counts as a horror story per se, although if you put yourself in Ragnathor's place when he realizes he has to fight the Nala over and over again millions of times, or conversely if you compare Ragnathor's outlook on life and the way he lives to Devin's fairly pathetic existence, there's an element of horror there too. I don't know, it's kind of up to you to decide whether you think that's horrible or not. From my perspective, I kind of think it works, maybe not exactly as a horror, but definitely as perhaps a cautionary tale. I don't know. Anyway, I had fun with it. I hope you did. If you did, then I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and maybe subscribe to the channel, tell your friends about the channel. I know I've been a little bit bad in terms of uploads lately. I've just been incredibly busy with work, But I'm never going to put this down. This is an ongoing project, and it will be an ongoing project as long as I'm around. And if there are areas of hiatus, then I do apologize, but it's always my intent to keep going. I've got a whole bunch of stories in various states of completion. There's lots more coming, so please stick with me. Yeah, okay, well, thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.